John has given me permission to take the questions, so let me go right ahead. Over here and then in the back over there. Please, first, right here, please.
I was just wondering, when President Obama became president, and then he went to Egypt and he made that speech, and there was a lot of the different countries in the area, there was a lot of the different countries allowed the speech to be live on TV. And I was wondering, in retrospect, do you think that it had any impact on the revolution itself?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that, you know, the president, when Obama became president, I think he was very uneasy with identifying himself with this freedom agenda because it was a Bush agenda. And I think he was very uneasy about that. But, you know, in a way, the fact that his voice was not a loud voice in this actually, I think, worked to a certain advantage because it became even clearer that this was not something made in America. It was made inside. I don't think that speech contributed to this. In fact, you know, I've heard some people, some Egyptians tell me that they felt even that it might have been even a little patronizing to think that if you're just nice to Muslims, they'll like you when they wanted freedom and democracy against the dictatorship. But I think Obama's views are changing. I know that he's now asked his staff to draft a whole new policy as to how to respond to these fundamental changes, and we're going to be hearing that in the next few weeks. And I think it's going to be very different from what we heard in Cairo in 2009. In the back there, yes.
Yeah,
If you can wait for a mic, I think, and turn it on. Yeah.
I was wondering if you might comment that tribalism may not make democracy attainment insuperable, but could you comment about the role of tribalism making it at least much more difficult to attain for a unitary state?
Well, of course, this is a problem. You know, you can't destroy the past, and nobody wants to destroy the past. But states, you know, build systems that adapt to that. They adapt to that in their electoral systems. They adapt to that in the way people will be represented in Parliament. You know, you have to have a democratic system which allows these divisions to work themselves out. I was once, you know, my first visit to India in 1996. I remember when somebody said to me, "We're not democratic because you wanted us to be democratic. We're democratic because our survival depends upon being democratic." And that's a country which is so deeply divided linguistically, religiously, ethnically, and so forth. Democracy is the only way to work out these differences and to work out the accommodations. Again, in the back there, yeah.
First of all, I'd like to commend you on a very optimistic speech. I have two questions for you tonight. I come from Zambia. That's a country in southern Africa, for those of you who don't know. It's a neighboring country to Zimbabwe. As you all know, in Zimbabwe, we have a dictator, Robert Mugabe, and he was actually invited to the Zambian president's swearing-in ceremony. I wanted to know if you have any suggestions or ideas of how the countries, the bordering countries around Zimbabwe, can help in making that more of a democratic nation. Because political instability in Zimbabwe could eventually result in a domino effect, and other Southern African nations could also be affected by this. Do you have any suggestions for this? And my second question is that when you look at the changes, the transitions in China and Russia, you see very contrasting timing factors. In Russia, it was almost overnight with Gorbachev and the Glasnost and the different kinds of reforms that were there. It was almost overnight, like a shock therapy. But in China, it was more, and it is more slow, where they have economic reforms happening very slowly. And do you feel that the revolution in Egypt that just happened, do you think that was very quick? And do you think the steps that should be taken from now on should be looked at in a slow and progressive and gradual way, or should they also happen very quickly and in a speedy manner?
Well, starting with your second question, political change is always faster than economic and cultural change. You know, it happens quickly when, you know, government falls. Rebuilding after that, obviously, is going to take a much longer time. You know, I think that one of the problems that China has is not only that it's got an enormous internet population, it's producing a middle class, it's producing a much more stratified society, so there's more corruption and more unhappiness with corruption. China is a country that is producing its own its own transition in a way. The problem that dictatorships have is that, when they encounter economic problems, they don't have the legitimacy of having been elected to fall back upon. All they have is the fact, is what you might call performance legitimacy. And they're going to run into some troubles, and there's obviously a lot of discontent in China that maybe is not apparent because it's such a, to some people, because it's such a, its performance has been impressive in the last 20 years. But I think even that impressive performance cannot continue indefinitely, and whether they can withstand crisis remains to be seen. There's a very interesting Chinese thinker by the name of Yu Jiangrong, who contrasted between what he called resilient stability and rigid stability. And he looked at a country like Taiwan or India, and he said they have resilient stability. They can adjust to change when you go through these crises. He was really worried. He's at the Chinese Academy of Social Science. He's part of the intellectual establishment in China, and he was very worried about its rigid stability, that it sees every demand for change as a threat to the system, and it cannot make the adaptations the way others make adaptations. And I think, therefore, there's a great deal of unseen instability in a country like China. Regarding your first question, let me just say that just today I was coming up in the metro and somebody was asking me a question by email as to, is there anybody who knows about how to, find places for these dictators to go after they they get removed? And I say, well, what's going to happen? They all go to Saudi Arabia now. What's going to happen if Saudi Arabia changes? But they said that there was a program up at Boston University called Former President's Program. And Kenneth Kondo was there. You mentioned, I'm just thinking of that because you mentioned Zambia. Not that, but he wasn't an outlier. He withdrew in a much better way. He wasn't an outlier, although he was authoritarian when he was in power. What can be done? I think it's, when I was saying before about these emerging market democracies, South Africa is one terribly important country when it comes to Zimbabwe. And that's one country that I mentioned. What can be done to change their foreign policies? I mean, right now, they've got one foot in as being democratic and the other one still in the non-aligned movement. And they see democracy as sort of Western, although I think Egypt may change that. I think the pressure has to come from below. I think it has to come from NGOs and civil society. I think it has to come from independent media. I think it has to come from parliamentarians. That's why these networks I was talking about are so critical. And then the government will change. It's not going to become because, we lecture to them. It's going to come from within. Yeah, maybe right over here. Come a little bit more to the front. Yes.
I had two quick questions. When you were talking about autocratic repressive regimes, you didn't mention Saudi Arabia, so I'd like you to just give us your thoughts on Saudi Arabia. And the second thing is just about Ned that I was interested in. How have you in the past pressured the U.S. government to change its policy when it was supporting a dictator? For instance, let's say Mubarak in Egypt, or going back in time, maybe Pinochet in Chile, or Somoza in Nicaragua, or Batista in Cuba?
Well, regarding Saudi Arabia, obviously they're very concerned about what's happening in neighboring Bahrain, which is just a 20-mile causeway from Saudi Arabia, and they're very worried about that. I received on Sunday, a petition that was signed by 100 Saudi intellectuals, and it was as good a democratic document as you could see. I mean, calling for human rights, freedom of expression, separation of powers, independent judiciary, and everything. I said it to somebody who said, give me odds of what King Abdullah is going to say about that petition. But these governments like Saudi Arabia, I think, have a choice. Either they are going to commit themselves to serious and deep reform, or they're going to be in trouble. And Saudi Arabia will be in trouble if it feels that it can hold out against this. I don't think that's going to happen. Regarding the NED, we're not a policy organization. As John mentioned, we're bipartisan. We don't intervene on issues of policy. We don't tell the United States you should do this or that. We try to operate within a bipartisan framework. There are things that we can do, however, in a subtle way that in a way you might think influence policy. We, for example, every year give a democracy award. Last June, we gave our democracy award. It was June 10th when we did this. We honored the Green Movement in Iran. We had a big we had a big event, a conference, and then an event on the Hill. We had a statement from President Obama. We got Samantha Power to come and deliver the statement and give one of her own. We had members of Congress there. It was a way of putting that issue right at the center of the agenda. We can do that. That's perfectly appropriate. We're not saying what we think of U.S. policy one way or the other, and we do that we can do that on many issues. And I think that's one of the reasons why the NED is successful. We were set up as non-governmental to be separated from the kinds of policy decisions that our government has to make. We have a lot of interest in the government. They inevitably have, sometimes it gets them into trouble, like it did with, when these governments are overthrown. But they have, broad foreign policy interests, and they have to pursue them. We were separated from that, and the condition of that separation was that we don't intervene on policy. Maybe over here. Yes.
Like anything else, political leadership is a skill that is learned by experience. And it strikes me that people, when you had dictators like Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi in Libya, they stunted the growth of those societies by not allowing talented political leaders to emerge. So if and when they are overthrown, are you concerned at all about the long-term stability in terms of democracy, because you don't have people who have learned those skills as democratic and political leaders?
Look, if Egypt develops a real democratic process, it will produce democratic leaders. Not everybody loves the democratic leaders. Let's be, people, cynical about politicians, but it will produce a legitimate democratic leaders, and that's something that democracy has the ability to do. I think, as I said, that I think this is going to take time. I mean, Egypt really stifled any kind of alternative. They really wanted they wanted a symbiotic relationship between Mubarak and the NDP on the one hand and the Muslim Brotherhood on the other, because they could say, we're the only thing that stops them. It's either us or them, and they prevented the emergence of a third alternative or a number of third alternatives. And that's one of the reasons why I think some people who feel, maybe the Muslim Brotherhood would take advantage of this. The Muslim Brotherhood took advantage of what was there before. The strength of the Muslim Brotherhood and the weakness of the democratic forces are a result of the Mubarak system. What we need now is an accelerated program of trying to help these new forces, by the way, are much more advanced, certainly at the civil society level, than some people think. I mean, this was an amazing phenomenon, this youth movement that emerged. But obviously, parties will need help. They will need to, organize. They will need to get their message out. They will need to do all the things that parties do. I think one good thing is that we now, as a country, have developed over the past 25, 26 years a capability to provide such help. And I want to tell you that both of our party institutes, NDI, National Democratic Institute, and IRI, the International Republic Institute, are deeply connected in Egypt and in other Middle East countries, and are getting geared up and prepared for what is now going to be the major effort of this era. I wish that we, as a country, could get our own act together and get a budget so that we could have the money to do this. I mean, right now, Congress cannot agree. Here we are asking Egypt to work out all these difficult compromises, and we can't work out fundamental compromises to reduce the deficit. If that could be done, we could get a budget. I think the money would be there to really ramp up these programs. Right now, we're not there yet. We have a problem right here at home. In the back there, yeah.
You commented. Thank you. Yes, you commented a bit about the role that social networking sites such as Facebook and Twitter have played in spreading the revolution from Tunisia throughout the rest of the Arab world. Can you talk a little bit about the role that the Arabic television station Al Jazeera has played in countering government-sponsored media and really universalizing the cause? Thank you.
I kid you not, just this morning, I chaired a forum on Capitol Hill on the new communications technologies, and one of the 4 speakers on the panel was the Washington bureau chief of Al Jazeera. He was very impressive, by the way, and he was talking about the role of more traditional media in this, and he was saying how that one of the functions of the traditional media is that they build a kind of a consensus. They reach out beyond the parts of the population that are exposed to the internet, into the, not everybody is a young activist in Egypt, and there's a rural population. And I think Al Jazeera is able to reach beyond the sectors that the internet has been able to reach and played a very important role. I might note I was very impressed with this fellow. We're going to be, he had a lot of interesting things to say about the broader issues of the Middle East. And one of the things that I liked, and I sort of ended the session this morning on this, was he said that, whatever disagreements people in the Middle East have with U.S. policies, he said that Constitution of the United States, that resonates with people. And, I said, I think that we are now at a turning point. We are at a turning point. If the Arab transitions can work, if they can get their act together by really undertaking a serious process of transition and not just having the old elites dominating it and creating a new situation where you have, the NDP and the Muslim Brotherhood. But if those transitions can work, and if we as a country can really do what I suggested in this talk, to really mobilize an international response to this, I think it's possible to sort of see really a new relationship between the United States and this region. I think they want the relationship. I think we want the relationship and need it. I think they're open to it. One of the healthiest things about these revolutions, in my mind, was that they were focused on solving their own problems. I mean, one of the problems you've had in that region is that it was always somebody else's fault, imperialism, colonialism, America, Israel, whatever. Here, people got together to solve their own problems. It was extremely healthy. And I think the opportunity now exists for a new relationship, and we should do everything we can to try to build that relationship. In the back there.
One of the interesting features of this whole movement is that it is taking place in countries that generally are quite wealthy. That is, and the wealth is in the hands of the rulers. Now, what would happen if the United States and the United Nations and whatever made a ruling, or whatever you want to call it, that the wealth that has been accumulated by the dictators in those countries will be used to help those countries? In other words, if Mubarak has $40 billion or more, as I have read, why not give those $40 billion to the people who want to build a democratic foundation?
Of course, that needs to be done in the case of all of these dictators who have stolen wealth from the people.
I mean, through oil.
But that's not enough. I mean, that's not enough. I mean, yes, it's necessary to do that, and it's the right thing to do, but there is no substitute for fundamental institutional reform. I didn't go into all the kinds of institutions. You know that in Egypt, 82% of the businesses are in the informal sector, the non-legal informal sector. They're not protected by law. They're not protected by contract. There are no property rights. If you could have regulatory reform to change that, to really create people who have a stake, who can take risk, because they are protected by contract and by law, they would become effective, successful entrepreneurs. Egypt has to produce jobs. And for that, as I said, you need education. You need to control the problems of corruption. You need to mobilize entrepreneurs and citizens to oversee the economy and the government to fight corruption. So it's not just a matter of, taking the money that was stolen. It's a matter of profoundly changing the institutional structure of the society so that these systems can work and produce for young people. Because if that doesn't happen, I think we're still in for trouble. Yes?
Picking up on your phrase, we have a problem right here at home. Your phrase, we have a problem right here at home. And using your background with Ned, what can we do in our own country to reduce the horrendous partisanship that we have that stops us from making significant decisions about the problems that we have?
Look, I'm spoiled in a way because, some people even, and John will remember this. I mean, we were like an oasis of bipartisanship. I mean, look, that's politics, and I don't want to be moralistic about it. That's politics. But you need people, like these 6 senators, this gang of 6 that are proposing, a bipartisan plan. And you need to work at that very hard, and you need to find areas of compromise. There needs to be more leadership on these issues. I think there can be. I'm not, going to start placing blame. But let me note that we have a serious deficit problem. That problem has to be dealt with, and both parties are going to have to come together around that. But we also have other problems that have to be dealt with, and you can't just solve this problem by just cutting expenditures. But it's a question really of leadership. I think the potential exists in both parties. I think they're you're not seeing a closing down of the government right now. I think that's interesting. A lot of people in the Democratic Party were nervous about the Tea Party types, but you got some very, very smart people that have now come into the new Congress. People like Paul Ryan, Eric Cantor. These are smart people, and I think that they're people you can do business with. So I think it's possible, and I hope that'll happen. Our democracy has to grow. Should we take 2 more?
Last question.
Our last question. Okay, please. Please, yes.
What would you say to the fiscal conservatives if they asked you for an example of a democracy that had been taken from writing a constitution through consolidation, about what the time frame looks like, what the likelihood of sustained progress through consolidation is, and what kind of a time horizon we'd have to continue to step up our investment in it?
When you talk about time, we convened a couple of meetings in the last month. We brought together some of the leading constitutionalists and transition specialists and others to sort of outline what had to be done in Tunisia and Egypt, because these were the countries of opportunity. And one of the things that somebody made at one of these meetings that I think is very important, he said he's a great believer in path dependency. In other words, however long it takes, you got to start on the right path now, because if you start on the wrong path now, you're not going to get to where you want to go. So there's no, I can, look at different transitions, and, look at our own country. We fought a civil war, 7 years after, the Declaration of Independence. And then we had 100 years of Jim Crow. We fight these things. You're constantly going to be fighting to improve your democracy. But it's very important to get it right at the start. I outlined how it could be done. It'll be a long process. I mean, the economic changes will be particularly difficult and painful. And I know it's not a great time to try to put together a program of international assistance. And note that I said that they have to, show that they can handle this. In other words, they have to have a program of reform. But this is going to take a real test of leadership by President Obama, by Secretary Clinton, by, the European Union, by the United Nations. This should be, I think, the top priority. I mean, everybody for the past decade, and I'm not in any way diminishing the problem of terrorism, but what has happened here has been the most devastating blow to al-Qaeda that anyone has yet delivered. And I think that's terrific. We have to make this work. Thank you. Thank you, John.